There would appear to be something within us that offers an innate sense of reverence upon viewing any kind of projected image. When something is presented on a stage or framed, we tend to offer some great reasoning to it, perhaps even if just to explain it to ourselves. There's a mystical quality to the reinterpretation of life that tends to entice its viewers. Perhaps it's our religious obsession with light representing the divine. Perhaps it's the ritualistic congregation around some symbolic representations that have awakened our unconscious minds and transform us into votive beings, eyes wide like the offerings of statues from Sumeria. Although we tend to think of cinema as a European invention, I would argue that the alpha of cinema is before recorded history, stemming from something more primal, existing since time immemorial. We must cast our minds back to envision a world devoid of all known storytelling, where the canvas was not only empty, but we had yet to find what the canvas may be. In the Paleolithic era, gatherings of people emerges around cave walls. Stories are carved and painted from pigments in stone, instructions for future generations, tales to explain the ways of the world in abstractions. This was their screen, and now there's an image. Thousands of years pass, and musical tales from Neolithic cultures emerge. There's a sound, and as we congregate in 100 BC in China, there's a movement in front of a crowd, and there's a light. This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. Try Mubi free for 30 days at mubi.com/cinemacartography. That's mubi.com/cinemacartography for a whole month of great cinema for free. In the Yellow River region of northern China, Chinese shadow theatre instigates our first glimpse into what modern cinematography would become. Shadow puppet theatre is the art form that featured handmade puppets capable of many gesticulations by a puppeteer. They told stories that were important to the lives and beliefs of the people of a village, and these stories were projected on a large screen for all to see. If we merely look at shadow theatre as a parallel to cinema, we would see that in many ways they're identical. The introduction of figures moving on a surface that almost matches the dimensions of a cinema screen. The introduction of colour in said projection. A team of people with various roles in order to complete the production that will be projected on a screen. The troops and individuals that were behind shadow puppet theatre required an intense skill set. The puppets were created using crafted techniques passed down through generations. The movements of the puppets often required great coordination, and the most proficient puppeteers were thought of as masters. The theatre's purpose was to provide entertainment to an audience which included both peasants and nobility, but it became far more than this. The stories strongly resonated with the people who felt that these figures meant more to them than just pieces of paper representing a story, that in many ways this was their way of conserving their heritage, honouring their ancestors, and even gaining insight within themselves. The masters that created these great productions were not just skillful because their job required them to be so, it was an honour to do so. The respect of the tradition was passed down, as the audience saw the puppeteers as something transcendent. These people were some of the first true artists, sculpting the landscape and minds of the people around them. To achieve greatness within their art could have offered no greater achievement. In fact, the level of production of a region or village's shadow puppet theatre was often a great indicator and declaration of power. The simple shadow play was a spiritual exercise that not only leads us towards what we now know as cinema, but helps us understand our primal reactions to why these projections resonate with us so deeply. We naturally project upon projections. This is a fundamental process in art, yet it remains both the artist and the viewer that grow through this experience of art. And with this beautiful expression of craft, history and audience, we could be looking at the first cinema. Shadow theatre spread throughout Eastern Asia and has always had its fingerprints across places such as India, Bangladesh and Thailand. Ultimately, a millennia later, it reached Europe after passing through the Ottoman Empire, transforming with each new locale and time. It was now the 17th century, and until this, congregations of the masses within Europe were often depicted as more macabre affairs. They had executions and barbaric games, a slight difference, but an interesting exercise in what Aristotle would have coined as catharsis. However, throughout this period, there still developed a greatly expanding culture of opera and other forms of theatre throughout the continent. This time, in the former, the exclusively upper class and nobility would gather to experience the world's greatest music performed in ostentatious fashion. There would be a libretto, an equivalent of a script, actors, set and costume direction. You see where the parallels lie. That even within Oriental and Occidental cultures, the places which developed independently of one another have always had an innate need to experience the great sacraments of life through abstraction. There appears to be an inherent need to gather around and watch the stories that seem to reside within us, and whether they appear as the intimate and delicate puppets or the grandiose, awe-inspiring productions, the illumination from these types of gatherings represent a kind of sacred ritual for all of us, and if the pulpit is not present, then we seem to ultimately go towards another light. The aim is to establish that the intrinsic nature of humanity must be taken into consideration so that we can better understand our relationship with the devices and technology that create cinema, which brings us to perhaps the greatest tangible comparison that could be made with the invention of film and the culture around it, the magic lantern. Similar to shadow puppet theatre, the magic lantern also utilised a form of early projection. However, the predecessor to this piece of technology must first be established, and that forebearer is the camera obscura. For centuries, the camera obscura was a device intended to reflect inverted light through a pinhole onto a mirror and, using a lens, focus a projection of the real world onto any surface. Darkened rooms would be filled with an image of the light from the outside. Artists and draftsmen would often use this technique as a means to help trace certain objects or to copy their authenticity. The camera obscura, although an ancient device, is one that you can still use even today, and may be equally as hypnotized with the real-life playing of light and dark. There's a beautiful quality to a beam of light piercing through a darkened room. The light coming through the ceiling of the Florence Cathedral at the summer solstice evokes the same ghostly quality as that beam of light you see from a projector in a theatre. It mesmerises now. You can only imagine the astounding nature this would have had 500 years ago. The varieties of the camera obscura date so far back that, much like cinema itself, it becomes a difficult task to pinpoint the areas of development directly attributed to it. From prehistory through Mesopotamia, there are instances of all cultures experimenting with light and reflection. But a major discovery was that if an image from the light was able to be projected, then with specific amendments, inverted images could be painted directly onto a concave or stereographic mirror. The technology was primitive, but the discovery meant that imagery, imagined imagery, could be imprinted onto another surface through light. This realization was made by a Jesuit scholar called Athanasius Kircher, and as far back as the 1600s, we already have a form of projecting both real and imaginary images, as well as a device that would become the template for the first photographic camera. But what remains most important to cinema for now were the means that became quickly adopted of how to be able to project various kinds of images. These varied projections have been generally known as magic lanterns, and many variations of the magic lantern emerged. Each had its own name if there was but a minute alteration. though what distinguishes the magic lantern from the camera obscura comes with the discovery and invention of slides. The magic lantern was in essence a modified camera obscura, developed around the 16 and 1700s, initially using sunlight as the main source of light, painted an inverted image onto a mirror to reflect onto a surface. The technological developments for the magic lantern were vital. Eventually, the source of light moved towards lamps that were developed in the late 1700s, and then its greatest development occurred when paintings were no longer painted directly onto a mirror, but painted on individual glass slides. These glass slides would be inserted into a compartment that could be inserted inside the magic lantern. Light shone through the glass, travelled through the lens, and just like a camera obscura, emerged as a large projected image on a surface. The opportunities for this technology were glaring. An infinite possibility of images meant that there were simply more things that a viewer could be dazzled with, and having portable slides meant that it was easy to create even more lengthy and stimulating visual shows. Throughout the 1700s, magic lanterns featured almost exclusively within the society of the bourgeoisie, but eventually moved from the homes of nobles and outward towards a more general public, with an emerging tradition of travelling exhibitionists. Magic lantern shows toured the countries and were presented to small groups of people. The exhibitions would be presented as such. An individual would own a magic lantern with some slides and present the wonderful array of illustrations for the people's entertainment. Here, we still see the remnants of shadow theatre, for it's only a new piece of technology that's instigated a new range of possibilities. The immediate social implications of this new technology were quickly adopted by a Belgian physicist turned stage magician, Etienne Gaspard Robert. He first sought to develop upon these possibilities on the technology to transform the core experience of what a magic lantern show was. Robert, who later changed his name to Robertson, became a travelling showman and joined these new magic lantern exhibitionists. But with his amendments, he transformed the humble projection into a sensorial experience. The magic lantern turned into its most famous iteration, in what came to be known as the Phantasmagoria. Robert was a complete innovator and desired to affect his audience on a far more visceral level than any other magic lantern performer. Robert's magic lantern was nicknamed the Phantascope and would present several developments within the life cycle of the magic lantern. The versatility of the Phantascope astounded audiences of the time. Slides of the magic lantern now became capable of having several images on a single slide, moving from one image to another without disrupting the flow of a performance. A slide known as a pulley slide had a single image which could be moved backwards and forwards throughout the apparatus to create the illusion of movement. The lever slides had crank mechanisms that could be rotated, which would result in kaleidoscopic forms of movement, or even something as simple as the smooth movement of a door opening and closing. What separated Robert's magic lantern shows was the notion of spectacle. Magic lanterns were an amusement to the public at the time, and many people wanted to engage in the technology, but more often than not, the people presenting it were individuals showing off the piece of equipment. Perhaps it was best defined as a curiosity, something that evoked intrigue yet held limitations. Yet the Phantasmagoria was a different experience altogether. Much like a modern film set, Robert required a large set of skilled technicians and operators to fulfill his vision. His Phantascope no longer had to be stationary. If it were placed on wheels, it could be moved backwards and forwards, both increasing and decreasing the size of the projected image. With a team of people creating sound effects in the auditorium, you can imagine how Robert could have easily instilled the notion of a monster quickly approaching you. He even had multiple magic lanterns active at once. In some instances, a static magic lantern would have been placed behind the screen and projected a background, while the Phantascope in front of the screen would create foreground layers. The equivalent technique would be seen 250 years later in Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey and called rear screen projection. Robert was even foreshadowing the usage of cell animation. Audiences ready to experience the Phantasmagoria would come to sit in auditoriums that would be completely darkened. Robert would even go as far as to lock the doors to ensure a heightened sense of tension. He would fill the rooms with smoke, light passing through the fog, giving the illusions of phantoms floating around the room, as he would present to his captive audience his new magic lantern slides. Robert brought sophisticated technology and established that there was a market for the magic lantern in whatever this new form of entertainment was. Whatever it was, people wanted to see it. Athanasius Kircher initially aimed to explain and demystify the goings-on of the camera obscura in his writings, divulging on the workings of light within the human retina. In essence, in a time of supernatural hysteria, Kircher aimed to bring a rationale within the world of the spectacle. Robert followed in that same sentiment, stating about his own phantasmagoric show, that which is about to happen before your eyes is not a frivolous spectacle. It's made for the man who thinks, for the philosopher who likes to lose his way in an instant. This is a spectacle which man can use to instruct himself in the bizarre effects of the imagination. Terror that practically every man experienced in the young age of prejudice, and which even a few still retain in the mature age of reason. And yet, people, even knowing that what they were seeing was an illusion, were still willing to be susceptible to the fantasy. For the idea behind the emerging technology of what would be called cinema was first and foremost regarded as an optical illusion. Precisely the idea that what was occurring in front of us was a trick of the senses, that what was occurring was a form of magic, and viewers at the time thought that the two were still indistinguishable from one another. The magic lantern underwent even more developments, lenses that could move backwards and forwards to increase focal length, methods that could alter the intensity of light, though perhaps we could say that though the technical developments within the world of the magic lantern were in some ways scientific developments, they were to primarily serve the audience. Meanwhile, throughout the 1800s, many scientists became much more interested in the scientific branch of optics. The developments of various lenses over the years had interested people greatly, but there still remained many great mysteries to the most important lens of all, the human eye. What wonders were yet to be discovered within the human retina? There is perhaps one instance in relation to the development of cinema which is most relevant to its technological and manners of conveyance. It begins with a device called the thaumatrope. This emerged in Britain, the source of which surrounds a number of various physicists. However, the concept was simple. The spokes on a rotating carriage wheel, when passing through various blockades of vision, such as Venetian blinds or an iron fence, appear to morph into curved lines. This is clearly a deception of one's own eyes, but to experiment on this anomaly of human vision, the thaumatrope was invented. The apparatus was simple. Two complementary images on two sides of a disc attached to an elastic band. The band would twist and make the disc spin, and if you were to look at the disc, you wouldn't see two separate images, you would see one composed image. Belgian physicist Joseph Plateau stated, "If a number of objects gradually different as to shape and position are presented to the eye in succession as brief intervals and at sufficient speed, the impression invoked in the retina will link them together without blurring, and so will give the illusion of seeing but one object which gradually changes its shape and position." Plateau spent his life studying human vision, to the point that the time he spent studying the sun's rays left him permanently blind. However, Plateau's research left us with vital information to the soon-to-be developed cinematograph. Images of objects in succession moving too rapidly will appear immobile to the human eye. Therefore, there must be a certain speed in which the illusion of regular motion is captured, wherein each characteristic of motion is not warped. A notion which has become a foundation for cinema and perhaps all visual literacy. We now know this more commonly as frames per second. Optical toys that sometimes unknowingly played with this notion became more and more commonplace in society. Devices such as the phantasmagoria were a cardboard disc with slits placed incrementally around the disc. A person would hold this up to a mirror and rotate the disc, looking through the slits. From here, they would see an illusion of movement as differently framed illustrations of a boy walking or rats crawling would dazzle the viewer with their fluid and realistic motion. The same anomaly occurred when the disc was spun too fast, however, where the image would become distorted and warped, for there was not yet an industry standard for what would constitute a consistent speed for a moving image. The Phantasmagoria found a more communal form in the zoetrope, which was again something that multiple people could experience at once. The fascination between static image toward moving image was becoming clearer, and the move toward image standardization had begun to take place. The theories regarding the human retina towards motion had been recognized but only officially theorized in the 18th century. It's at this point in the timeline that we begin to move towards our final benchmarks away from pre-cinema towards cinema. In the 1820s in France, the largest technological shift was about to change the magic lantern and all types of screen literacy. This was the invention of photography. This is the earliest known photograph of a real-world scene. It's called The View Outside of Le Gras, and it was captured by a man called Joseph Niepce, more widely known as Nicephore Niepce. The photograph was taken through a camera obscura onto a plate that had been thinly coated in an asphalt substance called bitumen of Judea. Niepce found that when this substance is exposed to sunlight, the substance would harden and leave a residue in its wake. When rinsed through lavender oil, he would be left with a black and white image replicating the remnant of light and shadow. The image itself is just visible. We can see multiple rays of sunlight striking both sides of the buildings. That's because the exposure for this photograph took 8 hours, and the light required to react with the bitumen had moved throughout the day, with some estimations claiming that the initial exposure actually occurred over many days. The contrast of the photograph is very high, although it still managed to pick up variations within the light and shadow. This technique that Niepce had developed was called heliography, and Nicephore Niepce began from here to liaise with the French chemist Louis Daguerre, who had a vested interest in the use of the camera obscura. The correspondence between the two was incredibly secretive, with Niepce unwilling to share many of the most important details of his invention. However, eventually, agreements were found for Daguerre to attempt to improve upon the photographic process that Niepce had worked on. It was from there that Daguerre developed the daguerreotype. The daguerreotype is very similar to our Polaroids. The process begins with a copper base that has a silver plating on top on which the image will be exposed. After polishing and treating the silver to give it more of a mirror finish, the plate is covered in a compartment to react with fumes from iodine and bromide, thus making the plate sensitive to light. The plate is placed covered in a box and then placed within a modified camera obscura, which later became cameras specifically developed for daguerreotypes. The subject would then have to sit perfectly still while the lens cap was removed from the camera and light slowly began to seep in, reacting with the silver plate. The images you have in your mind of people having to sit still for long periods to have portrait photographs would have first emerged from the daguerreotype. After what could have been several minutes of exposure, the plate was removed from the camera and washed with a sodium solution, cleansed, washed with gold chloride, and heated so that the image was fixed onto the plate without fading. Imagine the awe people must have felt. A few years prior, people were dazzled at painted images reflected onto a wall, almost convinced of their authenticity. And now, a few years later, you have an everlasting portrait of yourself or a loved one, Places and people that had been ignored by society with those whom they would never have had the opportunity. They were able to express themselves objectively. People would gather around their image like we would the cave paintings. This person had something to teach us, for it's the light of that very moment which you can now hold in your hand. Humanity now able to literally see itself in a new light. Photography became what everybody wanted to witness, with the daguerreotype being the catalyst for the avenue everybody wanted to see explored. What could be done with a real photographic image intrigued people far more than what was now becoming the archaic magic lantern. However, the initial processes for the daguerreotype didn't allow for the photographs to be projected due to its copper base. Magic lanterns were not capable of reflecting from copper. However, with William Henry Fox Talbot, a light-sensitive paper brushed with silver nitrate solution changed all of this. Talbot was able to fix images in place with various acids, and this albumin process meant that the photographs developed were not only capable of paper printing, but they were negatives, which meant, rather than the daguerreotype, which produced a single positive image, Talbot's negatives could produce through contact pressing and various emulsions multiple copies of a photograph. This paper process with silver iodide produced what Talbot called a calotype, which literally translates from Greek to beautiful impression. And although he may not have known, Talbot had just taken a major step in turning the visual medium into a fully fledged industry. Photographs now had the capacity to be projected, and two brothers, William and Friedrich Langenheim, produced projectable photographs for the magic lantern. We can trace the idea of their invention to a device called the stereoscope. The stereoscope was the birth of augmented reality. Whereas early daguerreotypes could not convey depth the way an artist's painting could, the stereoscope was a device that had an adjustable lens depth with two peepholes. A person would look through the peephole and each eye would be treated to two photographs taken at the exact same time across a slightly altered horizontal plane. They would form in the mind's eye, and in essence, became the first instance of 3D imaging which we have still seen throughout cinema. From this inspired invention, the Langenheims developed the Stereopticon, which was the colloquial name for the projector that allowed for the screening of life-size photographs. The projector had two lenses stacked on top of one another and allowed for the dissolve of one slide to another. This signified a remarkable altering in perspective. Audiences that had become accustomed to viewing projected paintings were in awe at these real-life wonders. The major attraction for many of the early Stereopticon shows were to dazzle viewers with images and places they'd never seen. Audiences would be taken from the streets of Paris to watch tropical animals of the Amazon, from Far East Asia to construction sites in New York. This was a spectacle for people, and whereas before any type of magic lantern was associated with the magic and theatre of the Phantasmagorias, now it had shifted to identify itself with real life. The Stereopticon became a crucial device in lectures, with someone often accompanying the images, explaining them in more detail. They were educational, and they were exciting. With the newly discovered printing process for photography, the photographic image became the standard of projection. It was much less time consuming and much cheaper to produce than individual painted slides, and people became enamored with what was real rather than what was not. However, there still were people that were projecting painted slides, and an interesting anomaly was about to occur. While the photographic projections were ongoing, people were still excited to see images they have only imagined before. Yet the painted slides, which in many ways were a more mature method of the magic lantern shows due to their longevity within the medium, began to develop new techniques. Primarily, their methods of storytelling had increased greatly. Poems would often be spoken at magic lantern shows, with accompanying slides that would depict the narrative. But these slides moved around. They were drawn from a perspective as we would expect in modern cinema, framing the area, a notion of an invisible fourth wall. And there was still an audience excited to see this kind of attraction. But it was because of this that something quite amazing happened. The visual literacy of people began to increase. certain routines within magic lantern shows they began to anticipate, to the point that in the later life of the Stereopticons, the theory behind the changing of the slides became more prevalent in the mind of the viewer. Previous to this, sporadic change was accepted. You could move from Paris to the Amazon. Yet where this was once used to excite the viewer became more enticed by a spatial continuity. They wanted a developing story that unfolded in front of them through photography. The earliest form of cinematic continuity had just emerged and was known at the time as the continuous plan. If, during the change in slides, the camera would move or change directions, these things would be explained to the audience. Complexity had been fully embraced in projected storytelling through photography. Creators aimed to capture the final hurdle that was authentic movement that could be projected, yet the means still eluded them. Devices such as the Phasmatrope would use a disc system similar to that of the Praxinoscope to show couples dancing. However, the photographic elements were still the same. The couple dancing would have to pose and hold their positions for moments at a time before moving on to the next pose, and so on and so on. Although audiences were impressed with the magic that occurred in front of them, the technology still remained just out of reach. This need of audiences wanting that continuity perhaps reached its zenith in 1894, when a man by the name of Alexander Black developed the motion picture Miss Jerry. Yes, this is perhaps what's widely regarded as the first motion picture. But rather than literal motion, Miss Jerry is perhaps more well known as a picture play. Similar to the stories that had become prominent within the Magic Lantern shows, Alexander Black used a technique of suggesting motion by having his actors pose in various poses that, when dissolved from one slide to another, gave the impression that they were moving. With handbooks displaying the credits, a curtain call for the actors, and at around 250 slides lasting for around 90 minutes, it almost immediately set the standard for the motion picture experience. And while this relationship between audience and screen enhanced, the ideas from the creators flourished, we were still yet to capture real motion on film. This is one of the most famous images in all of visual medium, frames of a galloping horse. The story that many people associate with this sequence of images is the method in which its genesis is remembered. Those pictures were taken of a horse to prove a bet, that when galloping, all four of its feet were elevated off the ground. Although the validity of the bet has never been proven, it's undoubtedly a charming story. The truth is that this story begins with an eccentric Englishman by the name of Edward Muybridge. Muybridge was a very successful photographer, taking famous natural pictures around the American continent. He was approached by the governor of California at the time to take pictures of his horse in motion. Muybridge believed the feat to have been nearly impossible due to the primitive technology of cameras at the time, yet he experimented with the governor in order to achieve what needed to be achieved. Several days of experimentation were required in order to have the horse confident to run across a backdrop that would capture enough light and have a camera that would be sufficient in capturing the horse during a gallop. The initial tests were sufficient, but Muybridge insisted that the governor give him time to develop a more sophisticated method of capturing his horse in motion. The result was this. Muybridge had a large backdrop measuring an equal distance between 24 cameras. The horse was to gallop in front of all cameras, which would cause it to trip a wire on each measurement. A spring mechanism would then activate within each camera, whose shutter speed had been set to take a photograph at 1/2000th of a second. The photographs were developed and the point was proven. A horse does not have all 4 feet on the ground when galloping. But being the fascinating man he was, Muybridge went one step further from this and developed the Zoopraxinoscope. Muybridge had a series of these kinds of motion photographs and found a way to display the illusion of their motion. By having silhouettes painted onto discs, special projectors could be manufactured so the disc could be rotated and have an animation projected on a screen without any interruption. Although only one Zoopraxinoscope disc utilised photographs, Muybridge had brought the notion of a 24 frame per second perspective and a mode of projection which was continuous. Although disc methods to allude to continuous movement had existed before, it was the means of recognising that photography required multiple continuous exposures, and it would then fully be able to represent real-life motion. We could jump back and forth between this timeline and find places and people of interest. Sir Charles Wheatstone in 1870 developed another stereoscopic device he named after himself, the Wheatstone Motion Picture Viewer, a rotating drum which too gave images the impression of movement. Even as far back as Athanasius Kircher's initial findings, evidence points to him also making even further developments towards the magic lantern. And I'm sure that as soon as Robert founded the Phantasmagoria, others followed suit with their own inventions. It's just like cinema. The innovators that expand the language will always have people following suit. But even those that aren't the first may too have their own ways of exploring that which they've borrowed from. In Hitchcock's Vertigo, the invention of a lens zoom with camera movement allowed for this trombone effect on the image. Some elements move closer, while others move further. It's a grammar so entrenched in the film, it would seem almost pointless to use anywhere else. Yet over 30 years later, Martin Scorsese would use the same method in this scene from Goodfellas. The two characters speak in a diner, while the view from the outside world begins to distort. The world is changing and closing in on them. All artists take influence from others, for inspiration is often the catalyst for progress. Other characters that we have not had the time to divulge on are still part of this grand narrative, even if many of them only planted a seed which was to blossom generations later. The Zoopraxinoscope was undoubtedly the largest inspiration for the final character in this story of pre-cinema, Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison and his assistant William Kennedy Laurie Dixon were researching the ability of celluloid film strips, after an encounter with Etienne Jules Maret, a French inventor that had converted a gun into a camera which managed to take up to 12 exposures a second. Maret realised that by using celluloid film, he could study one pose in relation to the next on the film itself, finding through these new methods of exposure great advancements in the study of nature. Dixon and Edison learned of this and decided to put all of their efforts into developing a motion picture machine solely using celluloid film. And although Edison is the preeminent individual associated with this invention, it was in fact Dixon that was to be the prime mover of Edison's motion picture technology. Even in many of the early experimental tests, it was Dixon that was the man present in these films. Together they learned that light-sensitive emulsions were what was necessary on these strips of film to capture sufficient light in successive short periods. And so partnering with George Eastman, the founder of Kodak, he supplied them with all the rolls of film they would need. It was then that Edison and Dixon were at work to develop a camera that could take this film and move it through an apparatus so that one piece of film could be exposed long enough to capture one frame, moved, held in place to capture another, and so on. The sprockets that you see on film are made precisely for that dragging motion. A device was created, and it was known as the Kinematograph. Taking the two major elements from both Muybridge and Maret, Dixon combined the two after being further inspired by the inner workings of a clock. And although these images could not be projected like the magic lanterns, what was instead created was a peephole device called the kinetoscope. And on January 7th of 1894, William Dixon received a long-awaited patent for motion picture film. That week, Dixon and other Edison employee William Heiss used their patent to record one Fred Ott, another employee of the Edison labs, using the kinetograph. And in January 1894, the result was this: a 5-second clip, simply known as the sneeze. Our story has passed through a millennia of technology and storytelling, and as we end our first chapter in the history of cinema, we see the world's first commercial movie. We'd like to thank Mubi for sponsoring this video. Mubi is a curated streaming service, an ever-changing collection of hand-picked films from new directors to award winners from everywhere on earth. Beautiful, interesting, incredible movies, and a new one every single day, always chosen by Mubi curators. Right now on Mubi, you can watch Autumn Almanac by Bellatar, a rare colour feature from the Hungarian auteur. Autumn Almanac prefaces Tar's more well-known pieces with experimentations into the style and vocabulary that would become synonymous with his work, presenting claustrophobic tableaus of the interconnected lives of people and their darkest secrets. You can try Mubi for free for 30 days at mubi.com/cinemacartography. That's mubi.com/cinemacartography for a whole month of great cinema for free.